Welcome back to another episode of the 6Ps podcast on the YouTube channel. It's time for a new series, and this is the first one of our Comparing Texts unit, where we're going to be looking at the Crucible and the Dressmaker. And today is all about the background information and everything that you need to know pre-reading the texts. So with this unit, it's really important to be very, very prepared. Obviously, this is not only just a SAC worth 60 out of the 70 marks this year in 2020, and next year and on beyond, we assume it's going to be worth 60 out of 100 marks, but it's also 1/3 of your exam. And my first tip is definitely to read the texts as many times as possible, because the more you read the texts, the greater your knowledge will be on them. Now, ensure you understand the social, historical, and cultural context of the texts. And I guess, as we're going to find out a little bit later on today, not just of when the text is set, but also when the text was written, which is particularly pertinent when it comes to the Crucible. And of course, it's important to look for unique examples and perspectives. As you can imagine, a lot of examples are sometimes overused, and we can rely on the same old characters and the same old scenes. So try and find, as I said, those unique perspectives or examples to make your writing more engaging for your marker and your examiner. So in looking at the areas of comparison, I've broken it down into 14 themes, I guess. Insular communities, conservative communities, blame and guilt, gender roles, social hierarchy, abuse of power, individual power, creeds and codes of behaviour, conflict and disunity, love and trust, truth, appearance and deception, and fear. So as I read through the texts, I often have all of these things written down on a bookmark to ensure I'm always thinking about these aspects. As well as this, you might also think about comparing the settings as well as the characters, but these themes are really, really important. Thematic comparison is often the most important. Now, there are a lot of ideas in these 14 themes, so my advice is to focus on a couple of them, and the ones that I like to look at are here. So insular communities and conservative communities are definitely the two. We're looking at Salem and Dungatar, two very closed communities based on very conservative beliefs and values, quite toxic places to live, especially for outsiders. And I guess they're also both full of vengeance. Individuals who want to seek revenge on others for past indiscretions. Gender roles is the next one I'd look at, and particularly because we see women's desire for power coming out. We see that for good and for bad in both texts, but we do have really strong female characters in Abigail Williams in The Crucible and Tilly Dungage in The Dressmaker. So looking at those really strong women and how they overcome what's expected of them in these societies. The next two work together, that abuse of power and individual power. So the abuse of power from authoritative figures and leaders, and the individual power, individuals who stand up against them. And I guess their contrasting fates is really important to look at. And the last thing I want to look at is conflict and disunity. Conflict between characters, obviously, a conflict between, again, individuals and groups, and disunity, and the way we see these settings crumble in the end. But as I said, let's focus on the background information, and I've got 4 key topics for each text that I'd like to have a look at today in a little bit of detail. Now, obviously, it's up to you to go into more depth in your research, but it's really important to know this information because it'll help you understand or form a stronger grasp of the characters, of the setting, and of the purpose of the author's writing and their intent. So with The Crucible, we're going to be looking at communism and MCCARTHYISM. This might be very familiar to many of you who looked at Rear Window earlier on in the year. We also have Arthur Miller, who is the playwright, the Salem witch trials, and Puritanism. When it comes to The Dressmaker, yes, we're looking at 1950s Australia. So again, earlier on this year, we looked at the Golden Age, which is set in 1950s Australia. We're doing the same thing here. In fact, the 1950s for our 4 texts at our school, each text is either set in the 1950s or was made in the 1950s. As well as that, we'll look at rural Australia, so looking at country towns, especially in the 1950s. We'll touch on feminism and fashion as well when it comes to The Dressmaker. Something to note though with the Crucible is we're looking at 2 contexts. We're looking at 1950s America as well as 1690s Salem in America. And again, while that can be quite complex, it can also ensure your writing is quite complex and sophisticated. So that's really important that we know both those contexts. Let's start with the Crucible. So when looking at communism, I guess a fear of communism permeated American society in the 1950s. And communism is a political ideology. It's based, I guess, on equality and communities and everyone working together to help each other. Now, following World War II, the Cold War, which was, I guess, an ideological war between America and Russia, was based on this. America was seen as being quite a democratic society, and Russia was communist. And there were very many wars that were fought because of this. We have the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And the fear in America was that the more countries that fell to communism, that would sort of seep out, and the whole, particularly the Asian region, would all fall to communism, and that would be a threat to American values and American society. Now, Joseph McCarthy was a senator, and he campaigned fiercely against communism. He actually helped to set up HUAC, which is the House of Un-American Activities Committee. And individuals with suspected links to communists or who were considered to be communist sympathizers were called to testify and name names. They felt that these individuals were threats to America, and many, in fact, were blacklisted. Many lost their careers and jobs because of this. And this fear of communism led to, I guess, an environment and atmosphere of suspicion throughout America, where neighbours would dob on each other. Sound familiar? It's very much common in Rear Window. We have this idea that comes through in Rear Window, you might remember. So with Arthur Miller, he's a really famous playwright. The Crucible is still studied today, obviously, and it's coming up to being 70 years old. But Death of a Salesman is another text that he's really known for, and he won Tony Awards for that. The other reason why he's quite famous is that he was married briefly to Marilyn Monroe. Now, interestingly enough, Arthur Miller was actually questioned by HUAC in 1956. In fact, many people in the entertainment industry and in Hollywood were questioned because many films and plays would actually speak out against this sort of atmosphere of suspicion. He wrote The Crucible in response to the rise of McCarthyism. That's sort of what the intent seems to be. And we have this idea that the fear of communism is very much linked to a fear of witchcraft, the fear of the unknown. It's interesting to note as well that throughout the play, Arthur Miller has these authorial interjections, these commentary pieces, where it actually discusses 1950s America, and he compares the town of Salem to America at the time. And while sometimes, because they're quite large slabs of text, we often do ignore them, I encourage you definitely to always read Arthur Miller's commentary in the play. Now, the Salem witch trials, from which this play is depicted, is actually a historical event. It did happen in 1692 in Salem, and many individuals were killed because of it. Those who were suspected of witchcraft were killed. Most of those who were suspected was done so because of sort of, as I say in the text, long-held hatreds, land lust, and just that idea that they could seek revenge through these trials. Now, many of the characters in the text are based on real people, though liberties were taken by Miller. And one of the main ones we know is Abigail Williams, who was only 11 in real life, but she's depicted as being 17 and having a relationship or having shared a previous relationship with John Proctor. Now, for more of that, there is a note on the historical accuracy of the play which Miller wrote, and that's on page 11 and is well worth a read. The last point here is that the fear of witchcraft which permeated Salem compares to the fear of communism in 1950s America, which we touched on before. And it's often said that the Crucible and the Salem witch trials are an allegory to that fear of communism and McCarthyism in America. Now, Puritanism is the last thing we're going to have a look at in the Crucible, and Salem, the setting of this town, is a Puritan village. The citizens are called Puritans, and it's a society which is based on strict religious beliefs, where hard work, discipline, and prayer make up every single day. And it was definitely a strict and somber way of life. And that is a quote from the text. We would find their beliefs to be quite extreme. They lived quite a conservative and traditional life. And it was actually, Salem itself was a really difficult place to live. The land was very hard, and quite often it wasn't uncommon for them to be marauded by Native Americans who attacked the village. Even Abigail Williams states that she saw her parents killed by Native Americans. Now, the Puritans fled persecution in England to seek religious freedom in America, and that happened in the 1600s. And this was a theocratic society where state and church combined. And the beliefs of the state are the beliefs of the church. So very much the laws are based on religion. And as I said previously, a really strict and conservative religious beliefs. Now let's look at the dressmaker and some of the key background information. So 1950s Australia, post-World War II, there was definitely an influx of migration from Europe, which led to an economic upturn. And Australia definitely became a much more multicultural society. We're still at a time where the White Australia policy is intact, and that's why many of the migrants came from places like Italy and Greece. Now, Australia was very much still isolated from the rest of the world, and still very much an insular society that had its own customs and traditions. We see this quite a lot through things like literature in the text, where Tilly brings music and books which are sort of unknown in Australia but are very much well known throughout the world, and also obviously her fashion sense as well, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But definitely this idea of really isolated in insular country. Now, rural Australia, we are looking at a text which is set in a fictional town called Dungatar, which is meant to be in the Australian wheat belt. So somewhere potentially Victoria or southern New South Wales, somewhere where wheat is important. Now, small country towns had their own codes and conventions, so they had their own sort of quirky traditions and way of life, and we see that in the text through the role of football, Australian rules football, and horse racing as well, where all the town come together for that. You should also note that there is a community hall in the middle of the town. Now, class was often a lot more pronounced in these rural country towns. We have upper class and lower class, so the Beaumonts definitely are that upper class, and the lower class would definitely be Teddy's family, and these are depicted in the text. I guess we also have Molly as well, would be considered quite lower class, and we also had that middle class, which we'd probably consider to be the Pratts. They own the town store, and rural areas definitely upheld more conservative and traditional values, not as extreme values as we have in Salem, but they still are present in Dungatar. Now, with feminism, I think this plays a really important role in the film and women being empowered. So, sorry, I should say in the novel, not the film. In the novel, I'll get to the film a little bit later on. Now, women were able to be more career-driven following World War II. They worked in the factories during the World War and played a really significant role in that. Now, in Dungatar, marriage is definitely depicted as quite desirable for women. Tilly's freedom, I guess, goes against this. Not only her freedom, but the fact she's travelled the world, the fact she has a career as well, especially given how rural Dungatar is. And the text precedes the 1960s, which saw the second wave of feminism, and I encourage you all to research that. But here we had a real revolution in terms of women being able to speak out and fight for freedoms which weren't granted to them previously. So things like abortion particularly were promoted quite vigorously in the 1960s in both America and I guess Australia as well. The last thing we're going to look at is fashion. And fashion through Tilly brings the outside world to Dangata. Many of the women admire Tilly for her haute couture fashion sense, which is sort of that custom-made and very elegant dress sense. It was quite transformational, and we see that with many of the women in the town. When they put on the clothing made by Tilly, they are transformed. They become much more confident and much more powerful. And I guess we see that quite prominently when we're talking about Trudy Pratt or Gertrude Pratt. And she's able to sweep William Beaumont off his feet, even though they are from a different class sense. It is important to note that Tilly uses fashion as a weapon in the way that she seeks revenge against the town at the very end of the text. But it's interesting to note that when a stranger comes to Dangata, she is shocked by what she sees. All these women in the middle of the outback, dressed as if they should be in Paris or Milan. And that's what Tilly brings to the town, that sense of class and elegance. So, with the settings, we have Salem in the Crucible and Dangata in the Dressmaker. And I've taken some shots from the film, and again, I'm going to talk about the films a little bit later. Salem, though, is on a bay. Again, a very rural town, very small, but on the edge of the forest as well. They were starting to become, I guess, finding a little bit more economic prosperity, especially through trade. Dangata, we know, is on a train line, and then it's very easy to miss once you go past it. But once again, we've got the main road, the gravelly main road, and we've got the Dungage house on top of the hill. But even looking at their clothing there, very much 1950s rural area. So let's have a look at some quotations from the text that describe the settings. And in the Crucible, we have Salem. Now, definitely encourage you to read the first 4 pages of the text, which is all Arthur Miller's commentary, where he describes the town and a bit of the background information of Salem before, and I guess to an extent after, the witch trials as well. The first quote talks about Salem being a barbaric frontier inhabited by a sect of fanatics. The word barbaric definitely has that negative connotations of being quite old and traditional, and the sect of fanatics, the fact that people that lived there would be considered a little bit crazy. The fact that children were anything but thankful for being permitted to walk straight with their mouths shut until bidden to speak. The fact that children literally have no power in this town is ironic because it's Abigail Williams who's the first to speak out and gain control of Salem. Their creed forbade anything resembling a theatre or vain enjoyment. There was definitely no fun to be had in Salem, which is perhaps a reason why the crisis started. Children particularly were unable to express their independence or freedom. And the last quotation, the fact that Salem folk believed the virgin forest was the devil's last preserve. That was a long-held belief. That is where the devil lived. They were on the edge of settled America, and it would be many years until that would be, or manifest destiny, I guess, and that crossing over to the west side of America. With Dangata, it's, in the first chapter, labelled a dark blot shimmering at the edge of flatness. And there's a really good description at the start, the fact that you wouldn't really notice it. It's sort of like any other country town in Australia. It's meant to represent that rural way of life. Now, there is a community hall in the middle, and it was not a busy road. This is the main road, and there were few shops at its curb. Again, very insular and very small. And the last quote suggests that cyclical way of life in rural Australia. The town will be quiet again, and the children will go back to the creek to play. The adults will wait for football season. The cycle was familiar to Tilly, a map. A nice little metaphor there to describe life in Dangata. Again, 2 really insular, conservative communities. All right, the big question. Should I watch the films? So this is completely up to you. I would definitely be listening to my teacher on this because they're going to know you best. But for my thoughts, why I don't think you should watch the films, well, they aren't entirely true to the text and they aren't entirely accurate. So you may reference inaccurate information. An example of this, or a couple of examples of this, I guess the first one is the idea that in the Crucible, the girls in the opening scene are portrayed dancing and singing around the fire. While this is referenced in the text by Reverend Paris, we don't actually see it in the play. And the same deal with the setting. In the film, we're in different houses, we're outside. In the play, it's 4 acts in 4 separate settings. And that's really, really, really important. So why should you watch the film? Well, I'd suggest you watch it because it provides a visual for you, for the setting as well as the characters, and that can be quite useful for students. But again, you cannot possibly rely on the film. I would purely be watching it just to get a visual. I would not be taking any notes whatsoever, just purely watching it for the visuals. And if you do so, please remember that it is not entirely accurate. And the last thing you want to do is reference something that happened in the film. So what are the key takeouts today? Firstly, immerse yourself in the world of the texts and think about the settings as well and how they compare and contrast. Consider the key areas of comparison when reading, and I really encourage you to have a bookmark that has all those themes and ideas written down, so as you're reading it and annotating your text, you're always thinking about those 14 ideas particularly. Remember as well to look for differences as well as similarities. I think quite often what we do is we just simply look for the similarities. This area of study really is pushing you not just to look for similarities but also differences, and we can tend to forget these. So don't forget, we're looking for differences and similarities. We'll be back with a few more episodes. We're actually hopefully going to be doing some annotating of the texts, but if you would like to get in contact with me, either leave a comment or email me at 6pspodcast@gmail.com. That's 6pspodcast@gmail.com, and we'll see you next time.